Are you okay?
I'm okay.
I get them to cry.
You know I can't get out of my head.
I know. Listen.
It just doesn't stop.
Jazz Jennings was once hailed as a trailblazer, the face of a new era in transgender visibility. From viral interviews to reality TV fame, she symbolized progress, courage, and affirmation. But behind the spotlight, a more painful truth emerged. What happens when a child becomes a movement before they've even had the chance to become a person? This is a story of what we saw and what we missed. Childhood, America's youngest transition. It began innocently enough, like so many childhood stories, with a child expressing a simple truth. Jazz Jennings, born in 2000 in South Florida, was assigned male at birth, but began verbalizing her gender identity as early as age 2. "I'm not a boy," she would say. "I'm a girl. I am definitely a girl. Like, that's all I consider myself as." At first, her parents, Greg and Jeanette, believed it might be a phase, but the insistence only intensified. When Jazz cried inconsolably having to wear boys' clothes or use male pronouns, her parents faced a decision few could imagine at the time to affirm their child's stated identity or resist it. Transition. By the time Jazz turned 5, her social transition was complete. She wore girls' clothes, had long hair, and was referred to by her chosen name, Jazz. She was, for all intents and purposes, living as a girl. But this wasn't just a private family decision. It was about to become a public phenomenon. Becoming a public phenomenon. In 2007, Jazz appeared on ABC's 2020 in an interview with Barbara Walters, becoming one of the youngest, most visible transgender individuals in the world. The segment was groundbreaking. A nation watched in awe and confusion as a bubbly 6-year-old explained her identity with clarity beyond her years. Walters looked stunned. The public was divided. Some applauded the Jennings family for their open-mindedness and compassion. Others accused them of pushing their child into a rigid label far too early. That moment, Jazz's bright eyes on national television set off what would become a firestorm. She wasn't just a child anymore. She was a cultural icon, a lightning rod in an escalating global debate about gender, identity, childhood, and medicine. Behind the scenes, however, there was something far more complex unfolding. Jazz's story was not simply about authenticity. It was about control, narrative, and the weight of representation. Jeanette Jennings, Jazz's mother, emerged as a powerful force in her daughter's life. She was fiercely protective, deeply involved, and determined to carve a path forward not only for Jazz, but for other trans children as well. She became the de facto spokesperson for trans youth parenting, booking interviews, arranging appearances, and later overseeing production on I Am Jazz, the TLC reality series that would follow Jazz through adolescence. But was it support or orchestration? From that point on, Jazz's life became inseparable from the media machine. Reality TV cameras followed her to school, the doctor's office, therapy sessions, and even moments of private reflection. She published a children's book, did speaking tours, and became a role model for thousands. But even then, there were signs of tension beneath the surface, an emotional burden growing heavier with each year. Jazz wasn't just living her truth. She was performing it on cue in front of millions. Puberty on pause. As Jazz approached puberty, her family made another bold and controversial choice. At age 11, under the supervision of doctors, Jazz began taking puberty blockers. These drugs suppress the natural onset of puberty, preventing the development of male secondary sex characteristics like facial hair, voice deepening, and genital growth. It was presented by her physicians and family as a medical necessity, a way to prevent the trauma of undergoing a puberty that would contradict her identity. To many in the medical and activist communities, this was a progressive, affirming step forward. But others raised questions that still echo today. Internal doubts. Was Jazz too young to consent to such an irreversible decision? Could a child truly understand the long-term consequences of halting natural development? For Jazz, the blockers were followed by cross-sex hormones, estrogen, to feminize her body. By 14, her voice had not deepened, her frame remained slight, and her physical development reflected that of a cisgender girl. On the outside, she appeared confident and content, but inside, doubts began to emerge. Privately, Jazz began recording diary entries in video journals. In one particularly unsettling moment aired on I Am Jazz, she confessed, "I feel like I'm living a lie. I don't feel like me." That admission rang alarm bells for many. For years, Jazz had been presented as the ideal trans youth success story. Happy, healthy, and thriving. But here she was, sitting alone, confused, questioning herself. The sense of unease was no longer just emotional. It was existential. Psychologists have long debated the effects of blocking puberty, not just physically, but mentally. Puberty isn't just about hormones. It's about identity formation, cognitive growth, and emotional regulation. Puberty blockers. By skipping this process, had Jazz lost something intangible? Critics suggested that by freezing Jazz's development, adults had also frozen her capacity to question or evolve. She had never known what it felt like to mature naturally, to develop alongside peers, or to explore identity in private. Every step of her self-discovery had been shaped, documented, and applauded in public. As puberty blockers became more widely discussed in the political sphere, Jazz's experience became a case study. To proponents, her story validated early intervention. To opponents, it was a sobering cautionary tale. And for Jazz herself, the burden of expectation, of being the right kind of trans person, of always smiling, always advocating, was slowly becoming unbearable. Her diary entries weren't just cries for help. They were warning signs. This wasn't liberation. This was a life increasingly disconnected from the self. The surgery that changed everything. Gender confirmation surgery. By the time Jennings was 17, her journey had become a case study in early gender transition, praised in academic circles, medical seminars, and trans advocacy forums. But beneath the accolades, a complicated medical reality was taking shape, one that even her physicians hadn't fully anticipated. In 2018, Jazz underwent gender confirmation surgery, a procedure designed to construct a neo-vagina. It was heralded as a milestone, not only for Jazz personally, but for the transgender youth movement at large. At the time, she was among the youngest individuals in the United States to undergo this irreversible operation. But the celebratory tone shifted quickly. On I Am Jazz, her doctors were candid. Because Jazz had been on puberty blockers from such an early age, she hadn't developed enough penile tissue to use in constructing the vaginal canal, an anatomical consequence of the very medical path her transition had relied on. As a result, surgeons were forced to improvise, using skin graft from her stomach to compensate for the lack of material. It was a delicate, risky endeavor. Complications arose within days. Jazz developed inflammation, intense pain, and issues with healing. The initial surgery, far from being a one-time event, became the beginning of a grueling medical saga. She underwent multiple follow-up surgeries to correct structural problems and infections, each procedure compounding the physical and emotional toll. "I've had a lot of surgeries," Jazz said in a later interview, "and I've had a lot of complications. But it was the quiet moments, the ones captured offstage or in confessional scenes that revealed the deeper damage." Jazz, once known for her infectious optimism, began to fracture under the weight of her experience. She spoke of feeling disassociated, numb, and unlike herself. "I feel kind of broken," she admitted. That statement reverberated far beyond the screen. It forced supporters and critics alike to re-examine a hard truth, that gender-affirming surgery, while life-saving for some, can carry profound risks, especially when pursued at a young age, under the scrutiny of cameras, and with limited long-term research to guide the process. What was meant to be the symbolic culmination of Jazz's journey, her full affirmation, became the start of a darker chapter. Physically scarred, emotionally depleted, and now grappling with the reality of a body rebuilt under immense pressure, Jazz was no longer just a pioneer. She was a patient recovering not only from surgery, but from the expectations of a world that had made her its poster child. Weight gain, depression, and isolation. After the surgery, Jennings withdrew from the spotlight, slowly then all at once. Her social media posts decreased. Her appearances dwindled. When she did return, she was different, heavier, quieter, more guarded. The bright-eyed child who once inspired millions had entered a private battle with mental illness. By her early 20s, Jazz revealed she had gained over 100 pounds. What began as post-surgical healing turned into episodes of binge eating, consuming entire pizzas, boxes of donuts, or thousands of calories in a single sitting. The weight gain was both a symptom and a signal. Something was wrong. Depression. "I'm spiraling," she confessed on the show. "Food is my coping mechanism." With the physical changes came emotional ones. Depression crept in, compounded by anxiety. She often struggled to get out of bed. Tasks like brushing her teeth or attending therapy felt overwhelming. Despite the unwavering support from her parents, especially her mother, Jeanette, Jazz seemed lost. In one harrowing scene from I Am Jazz, Jeanette confronts her daughter during a moment of despair. "You're just saying stuff and it doesn't make sense. I just want you to love yourself. Why is that so hard?" Jazz stares ahead, silent. The audience saw a mother desperate to pull her daughter back from the brink, and a daughter unsure if she could even be reached. The emotional intensity of the moment was a stark contrast to the early episodes of the show where Jazz had seemed untouchable, wise beyond her years, and endlessly resilient. Then came the academic detour. Jazz had been accepted to Harvard University, an extraordinary achievement for anyone, but especially for someone who had navigated life under such intense scrutiny. But instead of heading straight to Cambridge, Jazz delayed her enrollment. Her reason? "I need time to heal." The decision shocked fans. For years, Jazz had been a symbol of progress and potential, a living example of what it meant to thrive as a trans youth. Now she was stepping back, admitting she wasn't okay. And in doing so, she shattered the illusion that her transition had been easy or complete. This was no longer the story of a trailblazer breaking barriers. It was a story of a young woman isolated by fame, consumed by depression, and fighting to reclaim control of a life that had never truly been hers to shape. Was it too much, too soon? As the years passed and Jazz Jennings' once bright smile began to dim under layers of emotional fatigue, the question that no one had dared to ask during her rise began to echo more loudly. Was it all too much? Too soon? Even supporters of early gender affirmation found themselves pausing to reflect. Jazz's story, which had once inspired medical policies, TED Talks, and school guidelines, now revealed troubling cracks beneath its polished surface. Could a child at age 2 or 5, or even 11 fully comprehend the lifelong medical implications of a transition that would alter not just the body but the psyche? This uncomfortable line of questioning became impossible to ignore after a provocative 2023 article in Spiked Online titled The Tragedy of Jazz Jennings. The piece did not mince words. It accused the adults in Jazz's life, parents, medical professionals, and media figures, of outsourcing her well-being to a social cause. It claimed Jazz had become a symbol first and a person second, someone trapped in a well-meaning but relentlessly affirming narrative that did not allow for hesitation, ambiguity, or exploration. "I'm not sure." Critics question whether Jazz had been robbed of natural psychological development, intimacy with her own changing emotions, and perhaps most tragically, the right to say, "I'm not sure." On her show, she expressed unsettling truths, ones that were often overshadowed by upbeat editing or chirpy soundtracks. In one particularly jarring scene, Jazz confesses, "I don't experience sexual attraction to anyone. I don't know if I ever will." Her voice is monotone. Her expression is blank. In that moment, the image of a thriving, self-assured young woman fades into that of a confused, possibly traumatized adolescent, uncertain about her body, her desires, and even her future as a romantic being. The media had documented her transition step by step, but few had asked why at each step. Why were hormone blockers introduced so early? Why was surgery scheduled before adulthood? Why had no one on record questioned the psychological trade-offs? These weren't attacks on trans identity itself. They were critiques of a system, social, medical, and cultural, that had arguably treated Jazz as an ideological prototype, rather than a living, breathing, evolving child. As more stories of regret or complex outcomes surfaced from other early transitioners, Jazz's story began to appear not only unique, but emblematic. The affirming narrative, it seemed, had made no room for discomfort, no room for growing pains, no room for saying wait. And that omission may have cost Jazz her peace, the unraveling of a movement's mascot. At the height of her public visibility, Jazz Jennings was not just a name. She was a banner, a radiant, articulate teen who starred in her own reality show, wrote best-selling books, spoke at universities, and even inspired legislation. She was everything trans advocacy groups could hope for. Intelligent, sweet, non-threatening, media-trained, a mascot for progress. But the pedestal is never a safe place to stand. By her early 20s, that carefully cultivated image began to unravel. Slowly, then suddenly, Jazz was no longer the unshakable symbol of trans success. She was openly struggling with depression, binge eating, self-doubt, and post-surgical trauma. And as she struggled, so did the movement that had leaned so heavily on her story. Activists now face a dilemma: how to frame Jazz's unraveling in a world hungry for simple narratives. The backlash. Some advocates doubled down. They insisted that Jazz's pain was not a failure of gender transition, but a world still riddled with transphobia. If anything, they said, her difficulties prove a need for more resources, more support, more visibility. Jazz, they argued, was a pioneer wounded not by her path, but by society's cruelty. Others took a quieter route. Some LGBTQ organizations, once eager to highlight Jazz's story in brochures or school curriculum, subtly distanced themselves. She no longer fit the tidy archetype of happy trans teen, becomes happy trans adult. Her tears, her weight gain, her isolation, these were inconvenient truths in a culture still fighting to prove that transition can lead to wholeness. And through all of this, the political arena was watching. Conservative commentators seized on Jazz's visible pain to argue against gender-affirming care for minors. Clips from I Am Jazz were recirculated out of context. Headlines read, "Look what they did to her." To them, Jazz was no longer a case study in hope, but an overreach. She became a tragic prop in culture war debates. Her voice muted as both sides screamed over her image. Jazz herself had grown increasingly weary. In private moments, she expressed exhaustion, not just from her struggles, but from the burden of being a symbol at all. "I just want to be me," she said once softly. Not someone people debate about. But after nearly 2 decades in the spotlight, Jazz's identity was no longer hers alone. It belonged to panels, classrooms, state houses, and internet forums. She had been assigned a new kind of gender representative, a role no child should ever be forced to carry. And now, having endured the procedures, the applause, the trauma, and the backlash, the question remains, who is Jazz Jennings when the cameras finally turn off? A family divided by advocacy. Who is Jazz Jennings? For years, the Jennings family was presented as a united front, staunch allies navigating a hostile world for the sake of their transgender daughter. Their home was a space of affirmation, medical planning, TV production meetings, and press interviews. To the outside world, it was a model of unconditional love and progressive parenting. But the cracks were always there. They just weren't shown in the highlight reels. Jeanette Jennings, Jazz's mother, had always been the family's loudest voice. From the beginning, she was the gatekeeper, coordinating hormone treatments, pushing for surgery, defending Jazz's choices in her own to skeptics online and on national television. In interviews, she presented herself as a warrior mother, protective, passionate, uncompromising. But as Jazz's emotional and physical struggles intensified, so did Jeanette's frustration. The supportive tone began to fray. In later seasons of I Am Jazz, viewers saw moments that were jarringly raw. In one scene, Jeanette sits across from her daughter in the kitchen, her voice rising, her face flushed with fatigue. "I've been through this with you too long. You're just making excuses." Jazz, blank-eyed and heavy with sadness, doesn't respond. It wasn't just a family spat. The tension between mother-daughter. It was a symbol of something deeper, of the invisible tension between love and control, protection and projection. The dynamic between mother and daughter had shifted. Jeanette had long carried the banner of trans advocacy, but now critics began to ask, was it about Jazz's well-being or preserving a story they'd all committed to telling? Even supporters found themselves wrestling with uncomfortable questions. Was Jeanette in her urgency to protect and promote failing to pause and truly hear her daughter's pain? Had Jazz been swept up in a tide of affirmation so powerful that even her parents couldn't see when she needed to stop and breathe? A growing chorus online accused Jennings of overreach. Some called her the stage mom of a movement, a woman so embedded in the narrative of progress that she couldn't let go even as her daughter quietly unraveled. Every meltdown, every therapy session, every awkward confession was aired on television, packaged for mass consumption. Meanwhile, other family members showed signs of exhaustion. Jazz's siblings expressed concern in hushed tones. Her father, Greg, once a calming counterweight to Jeanette's intensity, appeared increasingly checked out in episodes, quietly observing instead of intervening. The emotional center of the family had shifted, and no one quite knew where to stand anymore. The public had once seen the Jennings as a symbol of hope. Now they looked like what they truly were: a family caught in the machinery of advocacy, media, and irreversible decisions. A family trying to support their daughter while grappling with the consequences of turning her into a national icon. And the most painful question lingered like a ghost. Had Jazz been allowed to grow into herself organically? Or had she been fast-tracked because the world needed a story more than it needed her to be whole? What Jazz's story really reveals. To say Jazz Jennings' story is tragic would be too simple. It's more than that. It's a reflection of the impossible burden placed on a child, not just survive, but to represent an entire movement. Jazz was never allowed to be just a person. From the time she was 6, she was framed as a hero, a revolutionary, a success story in the making. She became the first face of a national conversation on trans youth at a time when society was desperate for a poster child. In many ways, she fit the part perfectly. But identity is never built for an audience. By her 20s, that truth came crashing down. Despite her insistence that she still identifies as female and supports trans youth, Jazz began speaking with painful honesty about the hidden cost of her journey. She admitted to feeling emotionally lost, sexually disconnected, and psychologically depleted. She wasn't just dealing with the aftermath of surgery. She was dealing with the consequences of never getting a chance to wonder who she might have become without the cameras, the scripts, and the pressure. In one scene from her show, she says quietly, "I feel like I don't even know who I am anymore." That sentence should have stopped the nation cold. It wasn't a statement about being transgender. It was a human cry, one that exposed the emotional vacuum created when identity is shaped under constant scrutiny. Jazz's story reveals that even the most well-intentioned narratives can become prisons. Rushed to celebrate progress, we sometimes forget the complexity of individual lives. Jazz's tale isn't a warning against gender transition. It's a warning against premature certainty, over-medicalization, and the weaponization of young lives for political or ideological gain. She was praised when she smiled, when she said the right things, when she made it look easy. But when she began to stutter, to backslide, to gain weight, to admit confusion, suddenly her story became inconvenient. And yet, that's when she became real. What Jazz's journey truly exposes is a broader cultural failing, our discomfort with complexity. We prefer clean stories. We celebrate before and after transformations. But Jazz is stuck in the murky middle, a place where growth, regret, acceptance, and doubt all coexist. She is not just a symbol. She is a young woman trying to rebuild herself after a childhood lived under unrelenting pressure. A person navigating identity in real time, in public, in pain, and in that painful authenticity. Perhaps there's a new kind of hope, not the glossy kind, but the kind born from honesty, from saying, "I don't have all the answers," from saying, "I'm still figuring it out." Where's Jazz now? In 2024, Jazz continues to post updates online, speak about mental health, and engage with fans who followed her since childhood. She's working on losing weight, rebuilding her confidence, and finding clarity about her future. But there's a quietness now. The TV cameras have faded. The political spotlight has moved on. For perhaps the first time, Jazz is not a symbol, not a headline, not an ambassador, but just a young woman trying to figure out what it means to be herself. And in that quiet, we are left with a haunting question. What happens when a child becomes a movement before they've even learned how to be a person? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Until next time,